just moving a bit further away from this microphone because I think it's a, yeah, or I'm going up here. So, okay. Hello everybody. My name is Christoph Heuser. I'm the resident representative of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation here in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you all here for this event, and obviously working with all our esteemed guests and expert, Professor Joseph Stiglitz and Professor Martín Guzmán. It's a great honor and pleasure having you here. I actually have a couple of minutes for talk, but I think nobody wants to hear the director of the FS to talk, but we want to hear our esteemed guests. So let me just say one or two quick points I want to make, but I'll wrap it up basically. Because I think for the FAS, who had the pleasure to being working with Joseph Stiglitz and Martín Guzmán in several occasions, and a couple of weeks also with our FAS office in New York, within the ECRIC network, with our office in Argentina. I think it's really important for us to having this discussion right now here, because as we all know, there are several overlapping challenges in a very turbulent time right now. Speaking here from Brazil, there has been, you still listen to me? Yeah, you can hear me? Okay. The backlashes from socio-economic advancements a lot lately, obviously also the threat to democracy. Internationally, we have several geopolitical and geoeconomic shifts that will need to be addressed and discussed. So really wrapping it up, because I think that is trade and the discussion about trade and the discussion about the power differences we're still witnessing today within the international institutions, but also within trade itself. I think it's really important to discuss these issues, and it's really important having this discussion here right now in Brazil, because Brazil is very much in various debates at the forefront about the debates we're having. So, as I said at the beginning, I really make it short. I really would like to thank you again for being here, for discussing with us, for discussing several issues that are on the table right now internationally, and for discussing how to make the international economic order, the international order, more just and less divisive as it is right now. And I think it's really important for you being here. Thanks again, Joseph Stiglitz, Martín Guzmán. Thanks for the incredible partnership. The first one we have with the MADE, FEA, with the university. So thanks again. Thanks all for you for coming here, for your interest, and I'm wishing us all a great debate. Thank you.
And thank you, Christoph. As a German, perfect timing, 4 minutes on the dot. I'm Claudio Lucinda. I'm the chair of the Department of Economics at FEA-USP, and I'm here to thank all the presenters, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Professor Martín Guzmán. I'm here to thank the team of MADI for organizing this wonderful event. And in the name of the Department of Economics, the Dean of the Faculty of Economics, Business, Accounting, and Actuarial Sciences of the University of São Paulo, we'd like to welcome you all. We'd like to thank for your participation. And without further ado, I agree with my Christoph that you were waiting for the main keynote speaker. I leave the floor to Luisa Nassif Pires, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Economics at Unicamp, and also a director of the Research Center on Macroeconomics of Inequality, MAGI, at FEA-USP. She holds a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research, and also a research associate in the Gender Equality and Economics program at the Levy Economics Institute at the Bard College. Thanks. Welcome you all. Welcome.
Thank you so much, everyone. Oh, it's very loud. So I'll be mediating the conversation today. So I'll start by introducing the table, which doesn't need introduction, but anyways. So to my left, I have Professor Joseph Stiglitz. He's an American economist and a professor at Columbia University. He's also the co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD and the chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. Stiglitz was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001, as all of you know. He's a former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank and a former chairman of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors. In 2000, Stiglitz founded the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, a think tank on international development based at Columbia University. He has been named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Stiglitz research focuses on income distribution, climate change, corporate governance, public policy, macroeconomics, and globalization. He's the author of numerous books, including most recently People, Power, and Profits, Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy and Globalization and its Discontents Revisited. Thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz, for being here with us. It's a great pleasure. I also have with us Martín Guzmán. He's a visiting professor of public policy in the Faculty of International and Public Affairs of Columbia University. He's also a professor at the National University of La Plata, Argentina, and he's the co-president and director of the Sovereign Debt Management and Restructuring Program of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue. He's also a commissioner of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, ICRICT. He has been a non-resident senior fellow of the Center for International Governance Innovation in Canada, the Center for a New Economy, and Espacios Abertos, both in Puerto Rico. And last but not least, he served as Minister of Economy of the Republic of Argentina from December 2019 to July 2022. Thank you so much, Minister, for being here with us. And to my right, I have Gilberto Tadeu Lima. He's a full professor of economics at the University of São Paulo. He obtained his PhD in economics at the University of Notre Dame, US. And he's a member of the advisory board of the Macroeconomic Journal and a senior researcher at the Research Center on Macroeconomics of Inequalities, MAD, FEA-USP. Thank you so much, Gilberto. So today, Professor Stiglitz and Minister Guzmán will present their research on international trade rules for global economic development and prosperity, principles and power. They will each have 20 minutes for their presentations. I'll then pass the word to Professor Tadeu Lima for 7 minutes for comments and give back the word to Professor Stiglitz and Minister Guzmán, 4 minutes each for answers. And then we'll have 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. For questions, please use the form there. They will be sent to me, and then I'll be reading the questions that were selected to be read. Thank you so much, and without further ado, Professor Stiglitz.
Well, thank you all for organizing this and having an opportunity to bring us here to Brazil and share some of our views. The way we're going to organize it a little bit different. As I say, as the introduction pointed out, there are a lot of big issues in the global environment, changes in the global perspective, and concerns about global social justice that are on the agenda today. And so the way we were going to organize, I'm going to talk about a motivation for our paper that we're finishing that focuses on trade, a set of issues on trade. And then Martin is going to talk more about some of the results that we have in our analysis. And then we'll come back and I'll talk a little bit about some of the broader issues. So let me begin by talking about some of the motivation for this paper. There are, as I say, a couple of important motivations. One of them is basically the breakdown in the WTO, the rules-based system. We keep talking about the rules-based system, but it was based on a set of ideas about how the economy worked, sometimes referred to as neoliberal ideas, standard competitive equilibrium. If we can only get there, make it the market more efficient, take away barriers, it would lead to increased well-being everywhere. Now, there were many things wrong with that framework. One of the things wrong was the idea that it implied that taking away some imperfections would lead to well-being, even if there were other imperfections remaining. And that led to questions about the theory of the second best. It may be that if you got rid of all of them, things would be better, but getting rid of just some could actually make things worse. And many of you know about the theory of the second best. One of the theorems that I proved with David Newberry a long time ago was that if you had imperfect risk markets, incomplete insurance, which we obviously do, then moving to free trade could make everybody worse off in every country. It was a very powerful example. It wasn't taking all possible, didn't try to say whether that was true for our economy or any particular, but what I wanted to highlight with that very simple model that was published in Review of Economic Studies in 1984 was that the presumption that there was no presumption that free trade was welfare enhancing. That reducing barriers, you had to look at it in very particular context. Well, we have clearly a very second best world that we live in, and that was taking a world in which all the standard assumptions were true, except for one. There was imperfect risk markets. We're in a world where there's something that's really important. There are two things that are really important. Climate change, that's an important externality that we have to deal with. In fact, the world that you're going to inherit is going to be really terrible. I hate to tell you. But it's a first order thing, and it involves externalities. And the second thing is innovation. We have to innovate to deal with climate change, and we've had an enormous amount of innovation in renewable energy. We were saving labor rather than saving the planet. If you look at, the U.S. innovation has been focused around creating a better advertising engine. It made, from a social point of view, much more sense to center our innovation around saving the planet. So the market has not worked very well. But given that those failures, we're looking at this somewhat abstractly, but also at the same time in the context of major policy changes going on in the world. The most important policy change that we're going to focus on in this paper is industrial policies are back. For 30 years, America told everybody, everywhere, don't do industrial policies. There was a famous quip of one of my colleagues at Stanford, which was that it doesn't make any difference whether a country produces America, he was focusing on. He was chairman of Bush's Council of Economic Advisors. It doesn't make any difference whether America produces potato chips or computer chips. Now, in retrospect, we think that was wrong. That we are great producers of potato chips, but we are totally dependent on Taiwan for computer chips, and China has announced that within the next 5 years it's going to take over Taiwan. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but President Xi is committed to that. So we faced risk, and we are now, Europe and America are using the word, we are de-risking and trying to bring that back to the United States. And that means the U.S., bipartisan, has brought back industrial policies in a very strong way. 2 major acts. One was the Chips and Science Act, which is focused on those kinds of things I just described. But the other one is the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. The only reason it has that name is that it was the only way to get it passed through Congress. If you said a green bill, they would have said, green, we don't believe in climate change, the Republicans. It's a peculiar world that we live in, that half of America's, one of America's 2 political parties still denies climate change, even as the country burns and floods. And you know, to me, I don't understand it. But let's pass that on, and I won't go into my usual tirade about that. But they called it an Inflation Reduction Act. Who could be against reducing inflation? So everybody could agree on that act. So it's important. It was originally $271 billion, a lot of money, even for a rich country, to spend on encouraging firms and research in green, moving to the ecological, you call here the ecological transition, the green transition. We made a mistake. We underestimated the willingness of firms to move toward a green, and the estimate now is what was originally a $271 billion expenditure is between $1 and $1.5 trillion. That's a big deal. But the question is, the international trade rules were all predicated on the notion that they ignored innovation, and they were predicated on the idea that there's a level playing field. But if the U.S. is spending $1.5 trillion in subsidies, which were illegal, and they are illegal under the WTO, it's a level playing field. But, you know, as somebody concerned very much about climate change, it's important that we move. And so I actually supported the IRA, even though it was unleveling the playing field. So this is the fundamental motivation of the paper. How should international trade rules be designed to promote global economic development and prosperity, particularly now that we are focused on a green transition? And the nature of the difficulty of the problem is highlighted by Jake Sullivan, who is the National Security Advisor, which is the most important national security is structuring our international policy. He gave a speech at Brookings, which said, by the time President Biden came into office, we had to contend with the reality that a large non-market economy had been integrated into the international economic order in a way that posed considerable challenges. That's a euphemism for saying we don't like China. And the only thing the Democrats and Republicans agree on is we don't like China. But the point is that if U.S. really believed in the rule-based system, what would it have done? If China is violating the rules, it should go to the WTO court and say they're violating the rules. But the U.S. doesn't like that because China actually isn't violating the rules. And so, and because they know that, in effect, the U.S. has taken down has dismembered the appellate body, the court at the WTO. It's really very disturbing. It began under Trump, but it's continued under Biden. We've blocked the appointment of new judges. There are not enough judges for the court to function, and the court doesn't function. So we didn't take it because if we did, we probably would lose. But we've made sure that there's no court for that to be determined. So what did he go on? What he pointed out was America didn't just lose manufacturing, we eroded our competitiveness in critical technologies that would define the future. And basically he said, we will need to write the rules that we want in the future. Until we do that, we'll do what we want. So we have to recognize we are in, while America says we believe in a rules-based international trade system, what it really means, we believe in a rules-based system so long as the rules are our rules. And when we think the rules should change, until they change, we don't obey the rules. So we live in a very peculiar world, and we'll come back to talk about that later. But when we think about those rules, the question is, who shapes the rules for international trade? In the past, workers' interests, even those from advanced countries, are not really well represented in international negotiations. Corporate interests have a disproportionate influence in international trade ministries and thus have a disproportionate influence in shaping the international rules. I don't know how many of you know how the trade negotiations go on, but they go on in secret. And so the information is only shared with the corporations, the business interest. And there was a dramatic moment in one of the negotiations for one of the trade agreements that didn't go through, called TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, where the chairman of the Senate committee that had to pass the bill in the end said, I would like to see what you're negotiating, what you're trying to do, what is America advocating for. I want to see where we are. And they say, you can't do it. These are secret negotiations. We only share the information with the business interest. And, when I describe to others what is going on, they can't believe it. That can't be true in a democracy. Eventually, he said, if you don't share the information with me, you're not going to get it through Congress. And so they did. But it took that level of threatening to get this in the United States, that kind of, and it's even worse in other countries. So what I want to make clear that when you look at the political process by which treaties get negotiated, they are not really democratically negotiated. And then they go to Congress and it's an up or down vote. And at that point you say, well, it's better than nothing. But, how you do, as Arrow pointed out, how you do the politics, how you set the agenda really makes a difference. So the WTO rules are officially based on core neoliberal assumptions that give rise to the fundamental theorems of welfare economics, and for particular, the first theorem, welfare economics, that markets allocate capital efficiently, and the type of growth doesn't matter. And here are now going back to more standard conventional short-run economics. Theory predicts that under free trade, the countries will specialize in the production that is intensive in the use of factors that is relatively abundant. That's actually a lean theorem. And it leads to an increase in global efficiency. And within each country is better off. There's distribution effects. The Samuelson-Stoper theorem explained that workers in America might be worse off, but the country as a whole was better off. And because the country was a whole better off, there could be a redistribution that made everybody better off. But that redistribution never occurred. So that's the standard perspective, but we want in this paper to go beyond that perspective, and that focuses more on what's wrong with the standard assumptions. In particular, we're focusing on endogenous innovation. We're not going into climate change, but that really makes the argument that we're talking about even stronger. So there are two fundamental problems with the standard theory that I'll mention just very briefly. It assumes, it leaves power aside, how the agreement is reached, and I just described that before, and it leaves aside the fact that the standard theory ignores innovation. And as I hinted before, there's no theorem that says that markets are efficient in the level and direction of innovation. And I gave an example about, saving the planet, but actually there are a lot of theorems. There's a book that I wrote with Bruce Greenwald called Creating a Learning Society, and in that book we give a number of theorems showing that in general markets are not efficient in the allocation of, in the direction and pace of innovation. And most people think about the great strength of the market economy is about how it produces innovation. So the area that people really believe is important for the market is not covered by standard economics. I mean, it's really quite amazing. We've been talking for 40 years and 50 years about the virtues of the market economy in economics as an economics profession, but we have not addressed what most people think is the most important, is the spur to innovation. It is good in innovation, but it's not efficient. And that there are government interventions that can improve the pace and direction of innovation. So, in a sense, we're going to be talking about a particular application of that, which is the nature of innovation in a global economy where it could occur in different places. How do we think about how international trade rules interact with innovation? Mark?
So let me continue with the paper. First, a great pleasure to be here today at the University of Sao Paulo. Thank you very much for the invitation. And it's been a few great days in Brazil so far, in Brasilia over the last 3 days, and now beginning in Sao Paulo. So what we do next in the paper is to define a taxonomy of cases in which we modify some of the standard assumptions that Joe described in the environment that characterizes the two fundamental theorems of welfare economics. As Joe explained, there is no power, so the market works in a vacuum. Politics doesn't matter, and we know that no economic policy is feasible if it doesn't constitute a political equilibrium. It just doesn't happen. And the second is that in that environment that we economists call the arrow, the blue environment, agents in the economy have full knowledge about the space of states of nature in the economy. Everything that can ever happen is known. There's nothing new that come out of, for instance, human activity, human creation. So that's the lack of innovation in that context. And once we recognize that there can be innovation, the concept of comparative advantage changes. We may have a dynamic comparative advantage that differs from the static comparative advantage, and this is essential when we analyze the international rules for trade, because the way international trade is structured will affect patterns of production in different economies, and if innovation depends on the type of production, therefore those rates will affect the development capacity of countries around the world. So in this taxonomy, we define 5 cases, and we begin. So ultimately, the question that we want to answer is how should global trade rules be designed to promote prosperity of the world and the development of nations? And in the first case is the standard decentralized competitive solution, in which we have a number of countries that are roughly symmetric. None of them has economic or political power to impose a solution to the others. Each of them has its own welfare function, and there are no spillovers, meaning that the actions of one country won't affect the welfare of the others. And there is no global political system which corresponds with the reality that part for redistribution. So what will happen in that environment? There will be incentives to deviate from a cooperative solution if the environment is static. In a dynamic environment, cooperation might emerge if it's possible to punish those that deviate from a cooperative behavior. But in the static environment, there will be a trade war. The nations may last forever, but governments don't. And the right unit, the right political unit for understanding cooperation may not be the nation, but governments. So a static environment may make sense as an assumption for understanding the definition and implementation and eventually enforcement of international trade rules. So the solution, the global solution here would be international trade rules that punish policies that are distortive, the bigger than neighbor policies. This kind of environment or this philosophy at times is defined as the one that underlies trade, the inception of international trade rules after the Second World War, 1945, and the WTO, although that's not really the case, as Joe explained. First, the international trade rules, if we had international trade rules that really want to promote free trade, the trade deals would look very different than the way they look. If you have ever seen any trade deal, they are complex documents full of different clauses. The small letter of the deal matters. And if deals were country A and country B agreed to a free trade agreement, it shouldn't be longer than probably this page, okay? So that's not how things look in reality, and the characteristics of trade deals are such that politics is absolutely at the center, as we will discuss. So we move then to another environment, which the question is, what would be the first best global solution in an environment in which each country still has its own welfare function, but rather than having an impossibility for redistribution, we have now a global political system that enables redistribution. It's like if the entire global economy was just one political unit. not the war of sovereign nations we live in. And the first best, the optimal solution would be that innovation happens in the region that has a comparative advantage to innovate. The region in which the returns to innovation are higher, that innovation is funded at the international level, and that then the benefits of those innovations should be shared among the global population. That is, of course, incompatible with the war of sovereign nations, and particularly one in which there are large disparities in terms of power. Okay. So next we move to introducing power. And we think this is absolutely key. Over the last few days, we had very interesting conversations in Brazil with different parts of the civil society, the government, etc. Great discussions, as Luisa participated, including the tax reform. In every of those discussions, power is at the center, as the ones we are discussing today. When it comes to the tax reform in Brazil, well, the limits of what can be achieved have to do with a political equilibrium. Same is true for anything that has to do with setting or shaping international rules. So we move to an environment in which there is power, but power is constrained. Still, each country has its own welfare function, and each country does not internalize the spillovers that its economic decisions entail for others. There is no global political system for redistribution, but there is and there are asymmetries of power. And in a context of asymmetric power, the most powerful will shape the international rules, but the assumption we make is that once those rules are shaped, they are respected. As Joe explained in the introduction, that's not really what happens in the real world. The history of the international rules for trade show that when a country, the countries that become the most powerful nations or the empires of the world get there through policies that enable industrial development, at times including protectionist policies. So they don't get there through free trade. This was true for the US. It was also true for England in the 18th century. There's a well-known book by Ha-Joon Chang, Kicking Away the Ladder of Economic Development, that makes this point and analyzes the economic history of this issue. But we analyze what are the equilibrium characteristics under such an environment, and what will happen is that the powerful countries will set rules that maximize their welfare. Investment in the global economy will be, of course, suboptimal. Why? Because of the spillovers that are not internalized. The rules set by the powerful will be such that those spillovers will not be fully internalized, so therefore there will be suboptimal innovation in the global economy. Meaning that in an innovation, given the rules, innovation at the country level will not add proportionally to the global pool of knowledge. So if the US is innovating, the US will push rules that will protect the transfer of knowledge, patents, IPR, and that means that inequalities in the absence of shocks will be perpetuated and magnified. Of course, in a stochastic environment, there could be shocks. You know, empires can change over time for a number of reasons. And then we move to a fourth case, which we'll call the case of power abuse, which is a little bit as it's happening right now, and what Jake Sullivan described in the Brookings speech, that my translation of that is, we, the US, set rules in 1945 and from there on that serve our interest, although it's difficult to say what our interest means, because there are heterogeneous interests even within the US, the workers, the corporate interests, they are all different. But the point that the head of the National Security Council makes in that speech is that those rules no longer serve our interests, whatever our means, and we're not going to respect them. Because otherwise we will lose competitive advantage to China in key sectors of the economy and key sectors for security of the US, and therefore for the capacity of the US to transcend over time as the most powerful country. So this is the kind of environment we analyze, in which rather than having the environment of the previous case, power not only determines the international rules, but also the enforcement of those rules. And this means that it was in the limit as if rules were determined for one period, a static setup. Because you can the powerful can change the rules or not enforce the rules and change them period after period. So this is the case of abuse of power, as it's happening now with the WTO. You know, countries like ours, my country, for instance, we've been told not to do industrial policies for decades, not to implement subsidies, because those subsidies will violate WTO rules. And what the US is doing now is implementing subsidies, massive subsidies, on the basis now of resilience, right, on the basis of national security. But ultimately, those are the kind of industrial policies that are at tension, and I would say in violation of WTO rules. So this is a case in which rules are worse than not having rules from the viewpoint of the disadvantaged countries, but are better for the advantaged countries. The disadvantaged countries will not want no rules, because rules increase global inequality with respect to the status quo. And then we move to a final case. Well, there will be one more that Joe will describe, a nicer one. But it's a case in which there is international voting, and this doesn't resolve the quandary we face here. The point is, how do we define voting power? On the basis of what? Suppose that we have a system of international rules in which is one country, one vote. Well, that would give too much power to small countries. That's a bit like FIFA in soccer, and it doesn't work very well, right? I mean, we know the corruption and the collusion, and we end up having a World Cup in Qatar, which, luckily for us, you know, I'm not going to say anything about it. But the point here is that if we have a voting system for setting the international rules, and once these rules are set, they are respected by all, the equilibrium will depend on the probability density function of countries' power. If the distribution of power is such that the poor get more power, they will vote for a system of rules that maximize the diffusion of knowledge, because they will benefit from that diffusion of knowledge, because they are further from the knowledge frontier. On the other hand, if the more advanced countries have more power at setting the rules, they will vote for less diffusion of knowledge, for more stringent IPR patents to preserve the advantage they have. So ultimately, there is no obvious solution to the quandary we face, at least in terms of being a political equilibrium. We know that power is a power matter, power is key. What this taxonomy, the question that this taxonomy raises is whether it's possible to have any international rule of law for trade at all. And hopefully, yes, but that's a question that doesn't get resolved through this taxonomy. One final comment before we go back to Joe's analysis of what would constitute a fair and compassionate solution, which is better that Joe does it because he's more compassionate than me. But one final comment on the issue of the characteristics of the processes that lead to setting the international rules. The fact that negotiations in practice are highly secretive is key for the shape, the characteristics of those rules. One good example is the deal between the European Union and the Mercosur. Have you ever seen the entire deal? Who has seen that? It's the problem with that is that there are more chances of exploitation from the powerful to the less powerful, and not just through political capture, but also through cognitive capture. That actually matters in real life. If there was more transparency, there would be less chances of exploitation because civil society would be more able to engage and governments would be more accountable to what they negotiate. But let's move to what would constitute a fair and compassionate solution to these problems.
Okay. So I'm just going to spend a minute talking about this and then move on to some broader issues. So this is, what I'm going to talk about is an idealistic solution. One way, the question we ask at this point is, how could you think about what ought to be the answer? We began with the first best, how an economist would look at it. If we had no power, we could, or the power was to me as a benevolent dictator, and I could then decide where innovation would occur, and I would make sure that redistribution occurred. But now we have lots of constraints. We can't redistribute, for instance. We may not be able to move knowledge. But how do we think of a second or third best solution? And what would be, within that framework, a fair and compassionate solution? And what we're suggesting at this point, that we turn to the ideas that Rawls presented. John Rawls developed a very important theory. He was a philosopher at Harvard, a theory of justice. And he asked the question, what is a just society? And he applied that to some particular problem within a country. And what he said is that in deciding, say, the distribution of income within a country, the tax rules, you ought to think about justice behind a veil of ignorance. What would people want before they knew whether they're going to be rich or poor? So it's very similar to an idea that Adam Smith had called the dispassionate observer. So obviously, if you're already rich, you want to maintain your wealth. And you see this now in Brazil. A lot of very rich people are saying, oh, there will be very adverse effects from Lula's proposals to create a fair tax system. It's not really even progressive. All he's trying to do is reduce the degree of regressivity and ask the very rich to pay their fair share of taxes. So, let's be clear, it's not about progressivity, it's just eliminating regressivity. And they come up with an argument like it will be bad for the economy and everybody will suffer. Well, you expect them to make that kind of an argument. It's a very good self-serving argument that, and you always hear this from the bankers. Whenever there's a policy that they don't like, they say, it will be bad for the poor. And is really the welfare of the poor at the heart of the bankers? You have to be suspicious. So Rawls' idea is think about this issue behind a veil of ignorance, before you knew that you were rich, what would you say? And his argument basically is that there would be broad consensus on the contours of economic policy. We would all agree, that there ought to be progressive taxation, for instance. Now, there are some problems with Rawls' idea, but it gives, I think, a good way of approaching the subject. And we try to use Rawls' idea here in the context of the trade rules. And our argument is that a fair agreement might allocate the surplus generated by global cooperation equally. A compassionate solution might allocate a larger amount to those whose initial conditions are worse off. And a first constituent of a fair and compassionate trade agreement with endogenous technology is that if the developed countries provide industrial subsidies, they must provide incremental assistance for similar purposes for developing countries. It could be done in the form of money in a technology fund. It could be done in the form of cooperation in R&D and technology advancement. But unfortunately, that's not yet where we're going. Some of us are trying to move the US and Europe in that way. But Europe's response to the IRA was, we'll also increase our technology subsidies to create an even more unlevel playing field for the emerging markets. And so rather than moving towards, right now, a compassionate solution, we're moving away from it. And as I say, one of the things that we're trying to do, FES and the other global think tanks that are working for an open society, that are for a fairer world, this is one of the things that is very high on the agenda. So what I want to do now is to talk about, very briefly, a few other issues that are on the agenda today as we think about the major changes that are going on in the global landscape, in particular as we move to a multipolar world with diffuse power. How many minutes do I have, or have we already used up our minutes? Are there negative? 5 minutes, okay. Okay, so I'll just touch on a few issues. So we have a multipolar world with very diffuse power. There was a period between 1990 and maybe 2015 when we had a world where the communism had collapsed and U.S. was the dominant power. We used to say there was a G1 that really dominated the writing of the rules. And this is a little bit of a digression, but I was in the Clinton administration, and we had a lot of fights over how we should frame our economic policy going forward. And unfortunately, I think, and I do sort of blame the Clinton administration, we made the wrong choice. We could have said, let's try to create a more compassionate economy. Let's use our power that we have to create a better global environment, and that would, in the long run, serve American interests. By creating a fair global economy, we would, in the long run, be serving our interests. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. What happened was that we were now unconstrained by competition from Russia. And so we said, let's use our economic power to advance our economic interest. Let's use our political power to we have less constraints, we can use our power more And there were a lot of fights. I won't name the names, but if you ask me, I will, of who were on one side in this battle and who was on, who were on the angels and who were on the devils. But they were both within the Clinton administration, and unfortunately, those of us who were trying to create a fair global economy lost. But now, in 2015, I don't know if you knew, China became the largest economy in PPP. Really interesting story, because PPP is how you compare countries using not an official exchange rate, but purchasing power parity. The World Bank does the indices, and they recalculated the PPP in 2015, and China was larger than the United States. As you could have predicted, neither China nor the United States were happy. United States particularly went to the World Bank and said, you have to be wrong. We are number one, and we will always be number one. And so they try to use their power to say, you have to change the numbers. China did not, at that point, want to be number one, because they were afraid that if they were number one, they would be hit by the United States and Europe. So both China and the United States went to the World Bank and said, redo the numbers. And the bureaucrats of the World Bank didn't listen to the political message. They said, we crunched numbers, and we redid the numbers, and China is number one. So the United States said, well, we won't pay any attention to PPP. We're still number one. And Trump said, we have to make America great again. The point I wanted to make is there's been a very big change in power as with the rise of China. And now we are in a new Cold War, but the divisions are markedly different. It's not centering around ideologies. Many leaders of emerging markets today are educated in the West. They're pro-market, but they're anti-hypocrisy, against abuses of power. They're concerned about the well-being of their citizens. They went to some of our classes they were influenced excessively by excessively liberal academics in America, as opposed to those who want to just exercise power. They don't want to pick sides, even if there's a clear right and wrong, as with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so this is an opening up of the potential for large changes in the global economic architecture. And on the next slide, I sort of go through multiple grievances that emerging markets and developing countries have against the advanced countries, beginning with the vaccine apartheid, the hypocrisy about industrial policy, the failure to keep promises, a global tax reform that I'll come back and talk about very briefly that delivered almost no money to developing countries, a system of global economic governance that gives little voice to the developing countries, and a global financial system where developing countries, that is disadvantaged for developing countries. So let me just talk about two of them very briefly to give you a flavor of where I think the global debate is right now. The first is the global corporate tax reform. The question is, when you have a multinational corporation that operates in many countries, how do you tax the profits? And one of the things about, there are two problems. The basic framework that has been there for more than a century is broken. It's called the arm's length transfer price system, where the company gets to decide how much of the production actually occurred in a particular country, therefore how much should be taxed in that country. And the companies have, that system has been broken for a long time. In the United States, you have goods that are produced in various states within the United States. The goods move across the state boundaries all the time. It would be impossible to figure out how much is produced in each state by the transfer price system. So we use what's called a formulaic approach that says we allocate the profits according to a formula based on sales, capital, employment. And one ought to have a different rule for different kinds of production, for natural resources, for high tech, and for manufacturing. But anyway, the point I wanted, first point I wanted to make is that that system, the United States doesn't use the transfer pricing system because you can't use it. The world is just too complicated. And it opened up opportunities for tax avoidance. You pretend, corporations pretend that the value was created just by chance in Panama or in a low tax jurisdiction. So to give you an example, if you're manufacturing a textile, apparels, and they add in Panama the label made in Panama, that's 95% of the value of the cloth. Even though you would say that that's nothing. But they would say everybody wants something made in Panama, and that is really what creates the value of the cloth. And so it's taxed in Panama, and guess what? The tax rate in Panama is 0. So no taxation. And our companies have been as clever in producing good product, in tax avoidance, as they have been in producing good products. And the tech companies are particularly good at this. Famous case of Apple claiming that all of its profits in Europe were a result of 320-some people working in Ireland. And then they got the Irish government to say that if the subsidiary in Ireland is effectively controlled by Silicon Valley, there should be no tax in Ireland. So Apple paid 0.2% tax rate on its profits. Unconscionable. And we're talking about billions of dollars. So this is the backdrop for the reform. There's, Martin and I are in this commission, call it Independent Commission on the Reform of the International Corporate Tax System. And we had called for a reform, and the OECD undertook a reform. But guess what? If you have a reform done under the auspices of the advanced countries, and the advanced countries negotiators are basically controlled by the wealthy companies, the big companies in the advanced countries, what do you think the outcome of the tax reform is going to be? Tax revenues may actually go down rather than up, or if they go up, it's going a little. And how much of that is going to go to developing countries and emerging markets? Almost nothing. So it's been basically a failure. There's two parts of it. One part was good, which was that there's a need for a global minimum tax, but the tax rate was set much too low, 15%, which is much lower than the average rate in Latin America. And so we are worried that the minimum will become the maximum and tax revenues will go down. Hasn't happened yet, but that is the risk. It should have, but even the United States agrees, Janet Yellen has said, it should be much higher. The second part, though, is allocating tax rights, and that has been done in a very non-transparent way. They didn't even today, they want countries to sign up to a treaty where they have not yet disclosed the terms of the treaty. It is actually amazing. They're putting pressure on countries to sign on to an agreement where the terms of the agreement have not been fully revealed. And here, politically, we've been trying to get all the countries of Latin America to respond together to say this is not right, and to come up with an alternative framework. And our view is that the voice of the Latin America is heard together, it will be more powerful.